There's something strange that happens when you keep a journal long enough. At some point, it stops being a record of your days and becomes something else entirely, a kind of archaeology of your own mind. I've kept some form of journal since I was a teenager. Paper notebooks, voice memos, scattered apps, back to paper again. But moving it into a digital format changed something I didn't expect, something I hadn't even considered as a possibility: the ability to search my own thinking across years. That single shift turned the whole thing inside out. Suddenly, I could ask questions I never thought to ask before. What have I been circling back to every 6 months for the past 4 years? Which worries kept returning, and which ones quietly dissolved on their own without me ever making a decision about them? What did I believe 3 years ago that I no longer believe? And when exactly did that shift happen? Was there a moment, a specific entry where I can actually see the turn? The journal became less like a diary and more like a living map, a quiet map of my own mind over time. What emerged from that mapping was uncomfortable and clarifying in equal measure. I could see with uncomfortable precision which fears had never materialized into anything real, which recurring ambitions I've been describing as important to myself in private year after year, while never actually moving toward them, which experiences had quietly changed me without my ever consciously registering the change, the move, the loss, the long stretch of ordinary days that somehow added up to a different person. There's a particular kind of self-knowledge that only comes from longitudinal observation, from watching yourself across enough time to see patterns you never catch in a single moment. You can't see a drift when you're standing in the middle of it. You need the distance of time to notice that the shore has moved. And somewhere in all of this, a question started to surface. What would it mean to take your own thinking as seriously as a scientist takes data? To treat your inner life, the fears, the circling thoughts, the slow shifts in belief, not as something to be managed or pushed through, but as something genuinely worth studying. Not with judgment, just with curiosity. Most of us were never really taught to think that way about ourselves. We were taught to reflect, maybe, to write things down. But reflection without some form of structure tends to confirm what we already suspect. It runs in the same grooves. It takes something more, some combination of distance, honesty, and time before the real patterns come into focus. The version of me from 3 years ago had strong opinions about things I barely think about now. He was worried about things that turned out to be nothing. He was completely unaware of the thing that would actually reshape his year. Reading those entries isn't like reading someone else's writing. It's more disorienting than that. It's like meeting a version of yourself you remember being, but can no longer quite access. Someone who felt certain about things you've since let go of, and uncertain about things that have since become obvious. And yet, that distance is exactly what makes it useful, because it removes you, just enough, from the story you're currently telling yourself about yourself. It creates just enough room to ask, is this actually true, or is this just a pattern I haven't examined yet? There's a moment, and if you've kept a journal long enough, you've probably had it, where you open an old entry and feel something shift quietly in your chest. Not because of what you wrote, because of what you wrote again. The same sentence almost, the same circling thought dressed in slightly different words, dated a year and a half later, maybe 2 years, maybe four. And you realize you've been here before. You just didn't know you were going to keep coming back. There's something quietly disarming about discovering your own patterns. Not the big, obvious ones you'd admit to in a conversation, but the subtler kind. The low-grade worry that reappears every autumn. The creative restlessness that surfaces whenever life gets too structured. The same question about direction or meaning or belonging that you were apparently also asking yourself in a different apartment, in a different season, wrestling with a different problem that felt like the only problem at the time. And yet, here it is again. Recognizable, patient, like it never really left. We tend to think of our inner lives as progressing, moving forward, processing things and arriving somewhere new. And sometimes that's true. Growth is real, change is real. But the record suggests something more complicated than a straight line. It suggests that certain themes don't resolve so much as they rotate. They go underground for a while and then they come back, and you find yourself surprised to see them, even though the evidence of every previous return has been sitting in your own files the whole time. So, what does it mean to repeat yourself like that? One interpretation is that you haven't dealt with something, that the loop is a sign of stagnation, avoidance, unfinished work. But there's another way to read it. Maybe recurring patterns aren't problems waiting to be solved. Maybe they're more like fundamental frequencies, something structural about the way a particular mind moves through the world. The worry that returns every 6 months might not be asking you to fix anything. It might just be showing you something true about how you're wired, something worth understanding rather than eliminating. Scientists keep records precisely because memory is unreliable. We flatten things, we revise as we go. By the time we've processed an experience and turned it into a story we tell ourselves, we've already begun editing the original, smoothing it into something more coherent, more resolved, more narrative than it actually was in the moment. A written record resists that revision. It holds the version of things that existed before you knew how they turned out. And sometimes that earlier version carried the information that the cleaner, tidier version quietly dropped. When you start to actually map your own patterns across enough time, something unexpected happens to how you feel about them. They stop looking like character flaws and start looking more like data. And data, at least, you can do something with. You can ask what it's telling you. You can track when it shifts. You can start to distinguish between a pattern that's doing something useful, protecting you, orienting you, keeping you honest, and one that's simply been running on automatic, unchallenged and unexamined because no one ever thought to look at it directly. You were never taught to look at yourself that way. Probably no one was. We get reflection if we're lucky. But reflection without a long enough time horizon tends to loop around the same conclusions. It takes accumulation, entries, seasons, years, before the view gets wide enough to actually see the shape of things. The repetition, looked at honestly, turns out not to be the obstacle. It might be exactly where the real inquiry begins. Most of us have a rough sense of who we are, a set of things we believe, positions we'd hold if someone asked. But spend enough time reading your own old writing, and that sense of solidity starts to loosen a little. Not because you've become someone unrecognizable, but because the edges keep moving, and what the record shows, if you're willing to look, is exactly when. There's a particular kind of entry that's hard to read. Not the painful ones, not the embarrassing ones, so those exist too, but the ones where you held a belief with complete confidence, where you stated something as simply true about a person, a choice you made, what mattered or what didn't. And now you read it and think, I don't believe that anymore. When did that change? Sometimes you can find the answer. There's an entry a few months later where something cracked open, a conversation, a book, an experience that landed differently than expected. You could actually watch yourself in the act of reconsidering. Watch the certainty get a small fracture in it. Watch something else start to form around the edges. And that's a strange thing to witness. Not unsettling exactly, more like unexpectedly intimate, like catching your own reflection doing something you didn't know your face could do. Other times, there's no entry that marks the shift at all. The belief just quietly stops appearing, and somewhere between one year's writing and the next, a different version of the thought has taken its place, without ceremony, without announcement, without you ever having made a conscious decision to change. Which raises a question worth sitting with. How much of what we currently believe is actually chosen? And how much of it has simply accumulated, absorbed from the environment, inherited from the particular period we happen to move through, installed gradually without our direct participation, without us ever noticing the installation was happening? The beliefs we hold most firmly are often the ones we've examined least. Not because we're incurious, but because the most foundational assumptions tend to be the ones we look through rather than at. They become the lens, and you can't easily examine the lens while you're using it to see. What the record makes possible, if you let it, is a kind of belief archaeology. Not to destabilize what you currently think, not to generate doubt for its own sake, but to understand the actual shape of how you've changed, To notice that the version of you who wrote that confident entry in another year was also certain, was also reasoning from what felt like solid ground, and that the you reading this right now is almost certainly doing exactly the same thing. There's something humbling in that, and something genuinely useful. Because if you can trace how your thinking has shifted before, what loosened it, what replaced it, what the transition actually felt like from the inside, you start to develop a different relationship with your current certainty. Not skepticism as a posture, not endless revision, something more like calibration. The ability to hold what you think with a little more lightness, to stay genuinely open to the version of understanding that hasn't arrived yet. To remember that the person who reads this writing 10 years from now might look back on some of what seems obvious today and think, gently, without judgment, that you were still in the middle of figuring something out. Which, of course, you were. Which, of course, you still are. There's a list most of us carry without quite knowing it. A mental inventory of things we're going to do someday. Projects we've been meaning to start, directions we've been meaning to move toward, ways of living we've been meaning to try, people we've been meaning to reconnect with, skills we've told ourselves we'd finally develop once things settled down. In conversation, we describe these things as important, and we mean it when we say it. But the journal doesn't record what we meant, it records what we did. I started noticing this a few years into keeping searchable notes. I'd look up a particular word, a project name, a place, a recurring ambition, and find it appearing across entries separated by 18 months, 2 years, sometimes longer. Always described with the same quiet urgency, always positioned just ahead of wherever I was at the time, always about to begin. There's a word for the distance between what we say matters and what we actually move toward. Most people call it procrastination, but I'm not sure that's quite the right frame. Procrastination implies delay, a thing deferred but on its way. What the record sometimes reveals is something different, something more like a permanent relationship with a future that's always kept just out of reach. Not avoidance exactly, more like a kind of comfortable tension. The ambition held close enough to feel real, close enough to mention in conversation, but far enough away to never be tested against reality. And the record makes that visible in a way that's hard to replicate any other way, because it removes the mercy of forgetting. When you can search your own writing across years, the gap between intention and action stops being a vague feeling. It becomes something you can actually trace, something with a timestamp. That's uncomfortable. It's also clarifying in a way that's difficult to get through reflection alone. The question worth asking isn't why you haven't started. That question tends to generate a list of reasonable sounding explanations, timing, resources, competing priorities that feel true and are also on some level beside the point. The more interesting question is what purpose the not starting has been serving. Because almost always it has been serving something. The unmoved ambition that stays on the list provides something the pursued one can't. It stays perfect. It stays possible. It never has to encounter the friction of reality. The gap between the vision and the thing that actually gets made when you sit down and try to make it. Keeping it ahead of you means it can remain exactly what you need it to be. A proof of your own depth, a signal of your own potential, a door you haven't opened yet, which means it could still lead anywhere. I'm not saying this to indict the list. Some things belong on it. Some things genuinely need time or resources or a season of life that hasn't arrived yet. And timing is real. But there's a difference between a thing that's waiting and the thing that's hiding. Between an ambition that's gathering strength and one that's simply been given permanent resonance in a future that keeps moving forward just fast enough to stay out of reach. And the record, if you read it honestly, across enough years, tends to know the difference, even when you'd rather it didn't. The entries don't editorialize. They don't offer excuses or extend the benefit of the doubt. They just sit there, patient and accurate, holding the distance between who you said you were and what you actually did with your time, waiting for you to look. Keep a journal long enough, and you'll notice something strange about your fears. Not the large, legitimate ones, the fears attached to real stakes, real people, real uncertainty, where the concern is clearly proportionate to what's actually at risk, but the ambient kind. The low hum of worry that shows up in certain seasons, around certain kinds of decisions, whenever the future starts to feel particularly unresolvable. Those fears, when you track them across enough time, have a curious property. Most of them don't come true. Most of them just stop. There's an entry I came across once while searching for something else entirely, a paragraph about a specific situation I'd been dreading. Careful, detailed reasoning for why things were likely to go wrong. A few different scenarios laid out with what I can only describe as dedicated pessimism. I had no memory of writing it. More strangely, I had no clear memory of the outcome, because the outcome had been so quiet, so thoroughly unremarkable that it left no trace worth storing. The fear was vivid. The resolution had been invisible. That asymmetry is worth paying attention to. We tend to remember what frightened us far more reliably than we remember the moment when the frightening thing simply didn't happen. Which means our running sense of how often worry is warranted gets built on a systematically incomplete data set. We're keeping score. We just haven't been counting both sides. This isn't an argument for optimism or for dismissing what the anxious mind sometimes accurately picks up on. Some worries are warranted. Some fears are pointing at something real and worth attending to, and the right response is to take them seriously and do something with the information they're offering. But a lot of worry, probably more than we'd care to admit, isn't predictive, it's generative. It's the sound a mind makes when it's holding uncertainty it can't resolve through any other means. A kind of holding pattern that produces the feeling of engagement without actually moving anything forward. And the journal, over time, starts to show you which type you're dealing with. It shows you the texture of your youthful anxiety, the kind that sharpens attention, surfaces real risks, and pushes you toward action that later turns out to have been warranted. And it shows you the other kind, the circling, returning, never quite landing kind. The one that costs a real amount of energy and generates very little usable signal. The one that, if you search back through the record, looks almost identical to last spring's version, and the one before that, and the one before that. What would change if we actually kept score honestly? If at the end of each year we looked back at what had occupied our worry most and then checked how many of those things had actually materialized into anything worth the weight they carried? My guess is most people would find the hit rate lower than expected. Not low enough to dismiss the fears outright, but low enough to hold them with a little more looseness. To treat them less like prophecy and more like weather, worth noting, worth preparing for in reasonable ways, but not necessarily worth building the entire interior structure of a season around. The mind that worries well isn't the one that worries most. It's the one that has learned through accumulated evidence which signals are worth following and which ones have always just been noise. The fears that vanish wildly, without resolution, aren't the gap in the record. They might be the most instructive thing the record contains. What if you treated your own mind the way a researcher treats a subject worth studying? Not managed, not optimized towards some predetermined outcome. Actually studied with patience, with records, with a genuine willingness to be surprised by what the data shows. It sounds like an odd reframe at first. We're used to thinking of self-knowledge as something that arrives through experience or reflection, or the right conversation at the right moment. The idea of approaching your own inner life with something like methodology, with hypotheses, observations, anomalies worth investigating, can feel cold initially, too clinical, like you're trying to turn lived experience into a controlled experiment, when it's anything but. But the more time I've spent reading my own writing across years, the more I think the clinical framing actually undersells what's possible. Because what a researcher does isn't remove themselves from their subject. They pay closer attention to it than almost anyone else would.
A scientist keeps records because memory distorts. They track over time because a single observation proves very little on its own. They look for what doesn't fit, the data point that breaks the pattern, the result that shouldn't be there, because anomalies are often exactly where the most interesting information is hiding. None of that requires detachment. It requires the particular kind of committed, honest, sustained attention. And that's precisely what reading your own journal across enough time can slowly develop in you. You start to notice a difference between what you felt and what you wrote about what you felt, which are often not the same thing. One gets softened in the telling, one gets amplified, one gets attributed to the wrong cause entirely. You start catching your own interpretive habits, the way you frame difficulty, the way you assign blame or credit, the explanatory stories you reliably reach for when something doesn't go the way you expected. A researcher would call these confounds, the variables that shape the data without being what you're actually trying to measure. In inner life terms, they're just the lens you bring to everything. And you can't examine the lens while you're actively using it to see, unless you have a record of what you were seeing last year and the year before, which now from the outside looks like it was refracted through a slightly different lens than the one you're using today. What changes when you start looking at yourself this way isn't the content of your experience, it's the relationship you have with it. Instead of being fully submerged in every mood, every conviction, every wave of certainty or despair, you also become the person who can notice those states from a small, useful distance. Not dissociation, not numbness or detachment from your own life, just enough perspective to ask, is this a signal or a pattern? Is this telling me something genuinely new, or is this the same thing wearing a different coat this particular season? The inner scientist isn't looking for answers in the way we usually mean when we say that. They're looking for better questions, more accurate maps, the kind of understanding that doesn't arrive in a flash of insight, but accumulates slowly, from watching something long enough, carefully enough, and honestly enough to finally see its actual shape. That kind of attention takes time, it takes a record, and it takes the willingness to be wrong about yourself repeatedly, without taking it personally. It turns out the most interesting subject you could ever commit to studying is already right there, writing itself down day after day, waiting to be taken seriously. There's a version of you living in your old journals that you can no longer directly access. Not because the writing has disappeared, but because the person doing the reading now is different enough from the person who wrote it that a strange, quiet gap opens up between them. And you feel it the moment you start reading. I've read entries I have zero memory of writing. Complete paragraphs, coherent, recognizable in tone and style, describing days I cannot retrieve at all. Whatever that beheld has been erased entirely from whatever I carry forward, leaving only the record behind, like a note from someone who happens to share my handwriting. And I've read entries I remember writing vividly, only to find the content isn't quite what I thought I said. The emotions hit somewhere different than expected. The emphasis lands on a detail I don't remember caring about. The mood I was in contradicts the one I associated with that period. The version of events I'd been carrying around is a revision. The original is right there on the page, quietly contradicting it. What's interesting isn't the discrepancy itself. Memory is fallible, everyone knows that in the abstract. What's interesting is how unfamiliar you can become to yourself across even a relatively short stretch of time. 3 years isn't long. In the context of a full life, it barely qualifies as an interval. And yet, the person who wrote certain entries 3 years ago held things with a different weight, cared about different details, organized meaning in a different order, was living inside assumptions so foundational they didn't even register as assumptions until you read them now from the outside, and the frame becomes suddenly unmistakably visible. There's a philosophical question underneath all of this that's harder to shake than it first appears. How continuous are we really? We tend to experience ourselves as a single ongoing narrator, someone moving through time with a consistent point of view, accumulating experience, updating gradually, remaining fundamentally the same person underneath all this surface level change. But the journal suggests a less tidy picture. It suggests the narrator is shifting too, that the voice doing the telling changes in ways we don't track. don't announce and don't fully register until we're reading the old version beside the new one and noticing that the distance between them is larger than we would have guessed. Reading your past self isn't like reading someone else, but it's not quite like reading yourself either. It lives in a particular middle space, familiar enough to claim, distant enough to actually see. And that distance turns out to be useful in ways that are genuinely hard to manufacture through any other means. Because when you're close enough to recognize your own experience, but far enough removed to observe it clearly, something becomes possible that usually isn't. You can ask whether the story you've been carrying about a certain period is actually the most accurate account available. You can check the record, and sometimes the record quietly disagrees with the version you've been telling yourself. Not dramatically, not with a revelation that restructures everything. Just a small correction, a detail that shifts something slightly, a sentence that surfaces something you'd forgotten you knew. The stranger in the pages isn't someone to recover or return to, but they're worth meeting because they remember things the current version of you has quietly edited out, and some of those things are still true.
Nobody announces a transformation while it's happening. There's no internal notification, no moment where something flags itself as significant, as the kind of thing worth marking, the kind of shift you'll later point to and say, that's when things changed. It usually only becomes visible in retrospect, and sometimes the retrospect takes longer than you'd expect. Going back through years of writing, I've found entries that were clearly composed on the other side of some change, a quieter relationship with something that used to agitate me, a new way of moving through an old subject, a concern that simply stopped appearing in the record without any explanation being filed. No entry announcing that something shifted, no note marking the departure of an old way of being or the arrival of a new one. The before is there, the after is there. The crossing over is invisible. This is how most of the real changes seem to happen. Not through decisions exactly, not through insight or sustained effort, or any of the mechanisms we typically give the most credit to when we talk about personal growth, but through accumulation, through the slow, quiet deposit of experience and exposure and time, the kind of change that happens to you while you're busy paying attention to something else entirely, something you probably thought was the actual thing. It makes you wonder, how much of who you are right now arrived that way? Not chosen, not constructed, not the result of any deliberate self-improvement project you can name, just gradually absorbed. A shift in what you find genuinely interesting versus what you thought should interest you. A change in what makes you tired versus what gives something back. A quiet revision in what you're still willing to tolerate and what you've simply stopped being able to pretend is fine without ever deciding to stop pretending. The journal can't fully capture these transitions as they're happening because you can't observe a change you're inside of. There's no vantage point from within a shift to see the shift itself. What the record can do is give you enough data points spread across enough time that the arc becomes legible when you finally look back from a sufficient distance. Not the moment of change, that tends to stay hidden, or it may never have existed as a single moment at all, but the shape of it, the direction, the distance between where you started and where the writing shows you eventually were. And there's something in that visibility that quietly changes how you hold the present. If you've watched yourself change without meaning to, without noticing while it was happening, if you can trace the slow accumulation of ordinary experience into something genuinely different, then you start to trust that it's happening again right now. Whatever season this is, whatever you're currently inside of, it's changing you too, quietly, below the threshold of anything you could detect in real time. In ways that won't be fully legible until you're standing further down the road, reading an entry from this exact period, finally seeing what it was actually about. Most of what forms us never announces itself. It just shows up later, already part of the person you've quietly become. Everything we've been circling around in this series comes down to something deceptively simple. Not a technique, not a habit to install, or a framework to adopt, or a morning routine to optimize. Just a question. and the willingness to sit with it long enough for it to actually mean something. What does it take to genuinely know yourself? Not the version of self-knowledge that fits inside a personality type or a two-sentence description of your strengths and weaknesses. The real kind, the kind that requires time and records, and the particular discomfort of watching yourself repeat patterns you thought you'd move past, hold beliefs you no longer recognize, defer things you claimed mattered, fear things that quietly dissolved without ever arriving. We've covered a lot of ground across these segments. The patterns that rotate beneath the surface of daily life, the beliefs that shift without announcement and leave no record of their own crossing, the ambitions that stay permanently positioned just ahead of us, the worries that never materialize but cost something anyway, the slow changes that happen between the entries rather than inside them, the stranger you meet in your own old handwriting who shares your history but not quite your current point of view. What connects all of it is something I keep returning to. The gap between the story we carry about ourselves and what the record, read honestly, actually shows. That gap isn't a failure. It's information. And the question worth asking, the one that sits underneath all the smaller, more specific questions, is whether you're willing to take that information seriously. Not as material for self-criticism, not as evidence that you've been doing it wrong or that you should have figured something out sooner, but as data from a subject worth genuinely studying, from a life worth examining with the same patience and curiosity you'd bring to anything else you actually wanted to understand. The journal, the archive, the searchable record of your own thinking, none of it is the point in itself. It's a tool for creating enough distance to see. And what you're trying to see isn't some fixed, final truth about who you are. It's something more alive than that. The shape of how you move through things, the texture of what you keep returning to, the particular signature of how you change when change comes, and how you resist it when it doesn't. There's a version of self-knowledge that's about arriving somewhere, reaching a clear, stable understanding that you can hold on to and refer back to when you need it. And then there's a version that looks less like a destination and more like an ongoing practice, a commitment to keep watching, keep recording, keep asking, not because the definitive answers are coming, but because the quality of the questions keeps slowly improving. Because you get better over time at seeing what's actually there rather than what you expected or hoped to find. The archaeologist doesn't excavate a site to confirm what they already believe is buried there. They dig because they don't yet know what's down there. And that willingness to not know, to stay genuinely curious about your own interior life rather than settled into a fixed account of it, turns out to be one of the rarer things a person can cultivate. So, here's what I want to leave you with. Not a conclusion, not a system, just a question. If you went back through whatever record exists of your own thinking, journals, notes, old messages, anything, and you read it as honestly as you could across as much time as you could gather, what do you think you'd find that you haven't quite been willing to look at yet?